We marched through moonlit forests, over endless roads, plains and hills, till the day dawned. Then we stopped to rest, slept among thistles and cornstalks, and in the dusk shot off the rest of our ammunition at a deserted village, just to lighten the carts a little. Ruined villages, debris and char marked our way. Behind us the last houses went up in flames, woods burned on the horizon, munitions dumps were blown up, and flares, shells and bombs went up like fireworks into the night sky. By our side were other columns, occasionally the populations of evacuated villages with their carts and animals, or else dragging their households on their backs. Old and young women, children, pregnant women, single men, barefoot in ripped shoes, with sacking wrapped around their feet. We overtook herds of cattle and sheep. An endless column stretched backward and forward, making all the time for the west. In some places the forest was already burning, a last barrier against the advancing Russians. The dawn burned like a planetary fire, with the terrible force of beauty. We got across the Desna. Our little band found itself in a great mass of fugitives. Women, prisoners and soldiers were working on positions that would surely fall into Russian hands the very next day. It started to rain and didn't stop. We marched and marched. The day passed. Night fell on muddy, churned-up roads. Still we marched on. We found 3 hours of sleep in a ravaged village. Onward. We set off again at midnight. Day brightened. Low hill country, expanse of swamps, meadows, fields and pastures. Very slowly the landscape altered its aspect. We barely took in the rich villages and their beauty in the last light of September. Our progress became a reeling, almost a crawling. We clung on to the cart, deposited rifles and bread sacks in it, let the trembling horses drag us forward, while our legs mechanically moved on. No more sleep the next night. One man shot himself out of despair and exhaustion. Others remained behind, disappeared. Some went on ahead on vehicles and were lost that way. Panic drove us on. Uncertainty choked us. Marching and marching. Late the next morning we got to Pochep to be put on trains. The Russians were still pressing. Pochep was due to be abandoned the very next day. We waited timorously at the end of our strength. We had covered more than 90 miles in 2 days and 3 nights. That was our flight. We waited to be entrained. Armoured cars, assault guns drove up the ramps. Trucks without engines, shot-up artillery pieces, useless tractors were loaded up, wedged tight and made fast, as train after train rolled westward. There was no room for us. The railwaymen were drunk. Train drivers and firemen slept on the tenders. We plundered the stores and canteens, loaded our cart with boxes of wine and spirits, looted tobacco and cigarettes, put on new uniforms, brought sweets, writing things, and soap out of the basements where the charges of dynamite had already been put down, and we started to drink. Most of it went bad, was destroyed, or fell into the hands of the victorious Russians. Carts full of planks, beams, coal and scrap iron were saved. We had to march. Our new destination was Unecha. We were in despair, marching and marching. Noonday sun burned down on dusty roads. We followed the tarmac. Then we mutinied. With not many comrades, I climbed onto a slowly moving truck. Other units melted away. Only the drivers remained with their horses. The rest of us got away. No orders were capable of keeping us exhausted men back, and the desire to live broke out in us once more. We rode, and we asked no questions. The wind cooled our brows, and not until evening did we jump off. Endless columns of motor vehicles were dragging west on the tarmac road. Heavily laden troops marched more slowly on the side roads. We rested by the roadside and looked on the map for the village of Starosely, where we were supposed to overnight. Slowly, 5 exhausted soldiers with bleeding and inflamed feet, we followed a track through grassy hills and peaceful fields into the evening. The cool and silent country was already asleep. Lights blinked in a village on a hill. A girl pointed us the way. It was getting dark by the time we saw the first, houses of Starosli. We ransacked them for eggs, butter and lard, oblivious to the amazement of the women and the men's mothers. We settled in one brightly lit room, drew the curtains, got the women to light a fire for us on the stove, to fix us supper. Reluctantly and slowly they obeyed, muttering to themselves. It was an odd feeling. We had no weapons. There were voices outside, whispering but excited. I drew my knife and went out. A group of young men were standing by the window, listening. They looked at me and asked in broken German if we meant to torch the village. No, but they didn't believe me. With heart pounding, I went out onto the street. It was night, dimly lit by a few stars and a pale crescent moon. Whistles sounded in the dark. Shouts rang out from the bushes. I went back inside and reported. 3 of my comrades crept through the garden, listened out, and caught the sounds of an excited meeting. All of them were young men with sticks and scythes, now setting off in the direction of our house. The 3 men hurried back and told us. We had already broken up the chairs and other furniture, and armed ourselves with clubs and metal bars, and taken our bayonets in our hands. Now we came charging out and hurled ourselves against the garden fence, crashed through it onto the grass, and raced down the hill. Shots rang out after us. We ran down the track and stopped only when we reached the bottom of the hill from which we had first seen the lights. In that village we found lodging, soldiers, and something to eat. Our sleep was uneasy, but the partisans didn't bother us. I was troubled by dreams of flight, imprisonment, and death. Earlier I would sometimes see only myself wandering in the foggy land, and the spice of adventure affected these fights and travels too. But now the demons chased me through torture and flight, and these dreams seemed not to end. Early in the morning we returned to the tarmac road. A truck took us along as far as Unecha. I sat on the fender in the wind, saw meadows and stubble fields slip by, woods, shrubs, and villages, and I felt a blissful intoxication. The adventure of being on the road, relying on myself, and free, the ride west, and my near escapes of the past night transported me into a mood of exuberant joie de vivre. A feeble sun lit the plain, the wind tugged at my hair, my cheeks and brows were seared by the air and dust. The experience of velocity was translated into an inner surge. For a few hours I was free, a drunken traveller in the unknown, a little closer to home, and I enjoyed my liberty like an opiate. I didn't feel like a soldier, but like a human being, a vagrant abroad in a wonderful world. The factories and storehouses of Unecha appeared behind thin trees, railway tracks, freight trains going by. In the evening we arrived, collected ourselves and hooked up with other members of our platoon. More turned up all the time. We learned that some had already been put on trains in Clincy, and that onward transport was expected tomorrow. That evening we entrained. We weren't punished and barely scolded. Our comrades treated us to vodka and red wine. I have to say I missed my freedom and the adventurousness of being on the road. Slowly we headed toward Gomel, seeing always the same thing. Harvested fields in a storm, smoke clouds on the horizon. Russia was turning into a depopulated, smoking, burning, wreckage-strewn desert, and the war behind the front bothered me still more, because those it affected were non-combatants. I was partly responsible for this devastation and the grief it brought the people, responsible like all the nameless victims, like all the soldiers. I had almost forgotten that there was anything besides war and flight. I no longer dreamed of going home. Ahead of us a bridge had been blown up. The train stopped on the middle of the line in an endless chain of transports. Squads of sappers worked feverishly to rebuild the bridge. It wasn't quickly enough. Partisans took the villages around, the Red Army was approaching, and the last trains were already on the front line. Mortars shelled us, and we made ready to defend ourselves. Meanwhile, the travelling life continued. We ate up our booty from Pochep, broke into provision wagons and looted them, carried out boxes of sugar, wine, preserves, and meat, spent the day roasting and boiling, and the different kitchens vied with one another as to who could make the best dishes. We wrote letters we weren't able to send and drank far into the night. We sang over claret and liqueurs, vodka and rum, plunged into intoxication like doomed men, talked drunkenly about sex and science, reeled by the railroad cars, sat outside over campfires, were made ill by the cheap spirits and the sudden rich diet, and carried on anyway, made grotesque speeches about war and peace, grew melancholy, talked about our lovelornness and homesickness, started laughing again, and went on drinking, whooped and skipped over the rails, danced in the cars, and fired into the air, made a Russian woman prisoner dance naked for us, greased her tits with boot polish, got her as drunk as we were, and sobered up only when we reached Gomel after 5 days. By order, the rest of the alcohol was destroyed. We rode via Zlobin, Mogilev, and Orsha to Gorky. There we detrained. The flight was over. Now began the trench war to hold the line of the Dnieper. October sun decked the country in pallid gold. A cool wind blew over hills and fields. The grass yellowed. The blue air was redolent of damp earth, and a clear day passed. We were marching to the front. In the evening we rested in Andrichov. We lay around a fire of turf, wood, and straw. Ominous-looking clouds gathered at nightfall, and the sun sank behind the gardens in an orgy of purple, cinnabar, crimson, violet, and gold. The fire burned lower. We wrapped ourselves more tightly in our coats and put up our collars. Russian planes were bombing the village in phosphorescent light. We had many dead and wounded, and most of the horses were lost. But at midnight we set out. The darkness made it harder to find a way through the swampy hollows and over hills where the winter crop had begun to sprout. It was some time before the fires of Luki gave us a misty light to walk by. Hard behind the trench, after we had lost our way and in our exhaustion fallen asleep on the gun, we found a fire site and a hole in the ground to sleep in. We walked down the trench. Tarpaulins had been made fast to the walls, masking holes where a soldier might be asleep on thin straw. The night frost glittered on the ground. The sunny days brought with them a fresh wind and the evening's damp fog. The defenders often watched through the night here. Their guns rested in narrow rills. A small depression in the clay contained food, ammunition, and smokes. There was one more base ahead of us. Calmly we carted up beams and boards, built us a bunker, and slept, barely watched, while north of Lenino a battle was already raging, and Russian storm troops appeared at night in front of our barbed wire. The front was quiet. We felt quiet as well. Time dribbled through our exhausted hands like sand. We could see no specks of gold in it. We were tormented by lice and scabies. We went off to be deloused and slathered ourselves with sulphur ointment. Not before time, we were given clean shirts. The ones we were wearing had gone black. And so we moved into our winter quarters. Drum fire ravaged the trenches and woke us from our tangled dreams. Shells from all sorts of weapons were going up, and their detonation, impact, and whining approach made a single monotonous hurricane of noise. We threw ourselves into the deepest trenches. Earth and shrapnel struck our steel helmets. Even I replaced my forage cap. Only for seconds at a time did we dare look out into the fog-hung no-man's land. Nothing there stirred. Hours passed. The bombardment was unabating. We noticed we were at its focus. The Russians were already charging. Wave after wave of them flowed out into the valley and soon dipped out of our sight. We launched a few shells into the places where they were massed, plunged away from the gun, lay in wait, hazarded another race against death, all until night instituted a pause in hostilities. The Russians had broken through 1/2 mile to the side of us. It froze. Our temples. We pulled the gun into the gully, got help, and lugged it up the hill. A group of stragglers passed us, going back. The last. None spoke. The wheels dragged on the grass. A few shells whirred over our heads. We took a breather. A pair of us went back again. Slowly the Russian flares got closer. They were moving forward along a broad front into untenanted space. We stopped at our bunker. Muffled voices sounded somewhere, not near. It was a suicidal adventure. I lay down with my rifle, safety catch off, and my pistol in hand. My comrade fetched our bread sacks and packs, brought the blankets out. We made up our packs. The voices grew louder. They were very near now, and we could make out Russian words. We picked up our things and ran into the gully. Shouts and rapid fire from submachine guns followed us. Shadows, outlines loomed over the heights. A fireworks display of flares lit the scene as bright as day. We ran on, tumbled into craters and ditches, stumbled over dead, and finally got back to our new position. With a few more shells, the battle ended the next day. We were saved, or rather, we had been conditionally reprieved for an unknown period. Quiet days passed. There were the after-effects of terror. I kept seeing in front of me the wall of fire, smoke, earth and dust that we had lived and fought through. There was no escaping these visions, and whoever got away with his life would wear the burn scars of those hours as long as he lived. I had once again experienced the war in its full horror as an apotheosis of devastation and death. The blood dried in the clay and disappeared underfoot. The dead were buried. But after this experience, it wasn't possible for life to go on. No one who had been through this could ever be a human and a son of God anymore. Yet things went on. They had to be borne and gotten over. My will to live reawakened. My resources of mind and spirit stirred once more, as though replenished from some mysterious source. I wiped those days and nights from my life, buried them deep, as though they had never been. I built a bridge across the chasm of that time and started a new life on the other side. We were found a calmer position. For a few days we had quiet behind the front. Once more we walked in fog and through the night. We hardly noticed one another. We were shadows, conducting spectral conversations and heading into the light. The air was heavy with moisture and cool, and the brassy music of the front rolled back to us. The night was without danger, and our position was good, a long way behind the firing trenches, a warm and fully built bunker. And there we moved in. A few rainy days went by. At the beginning of November it snowed for the first time. The howling gale drove the wet snow over the grass. Our stove was burning. We listened to the crackling of the wood as it crumbled and the humming of the wind. The snow on the hill melted before it got light. We grew quiet. A fire, a hut in the rainy country, were always there for the wanderer. God saw to the beasts of the field, and he gave us his tender blessings at the right time. Battles and death recurred, but there were pauses periodically as well. Out of danger and pain, new ore came to the soul, and it was up to us to smelt it first into steel and then into gold. Even if we buried the faithless stars in iron coffins, still we carried light within us. A village was on fire in the night, but the stars were quiet above the dancing flames. I was out and lost my way among the trenches. Without realizing it, I was wandering through no man's land, and I was close to the Russian trenches before the red tracer from enemy machine guns showed me the way back. But everything slipped by me with that dreamy mixture of objectivity and confusion that registers things like a mirror, but doesn't grasp them. Quiet. The quiet did us no good. We were still wired after the battle and needed activity, finding it only in brandy and card games. We listened to the primal song of the gale and pondered. In this damned time, it was the best thing to be a soldier, and at least stand squarely in the midst of this life. I felt in tune with my fate in a way I couldn't justify. I no longer sought to fend off the inevitable, did my duty with a certain pleasure, and was surprised at myself. The memory of music and poems made me aware of the grotesqueness of my soldier's life in Russia, like some inner laughter, and I guessed that with the next drum fire, all this would burst like a soap bubble. But then the comedy acquired a deeper level. The war had become such an elemental planetary occurrence that everything else seemed fugitive, like froth and smoke, hoarfrost in the sunlight. Freedom, poesy, and song took up merely symbolic space, beyond reality. I had to be a soldier, inside as out, in order to exist in this reality of killing and dying. To keep a purchase on this ravaged earth, I had to die forlornly. That was what I thought when it was quiet, and I couldn't fathom myself. Suddenly I yearned once more for mobility and travels into the unknown. It was like the return of hope and desire. I regained belief in my destiny. I found trust in life and youthful confidence and awaited whatever might come to pass with equanimity. I waited for adventure, and my secret desire was fulfilled. One dark, rainy night we moved out. We headed toward fresh calamities, privations, pains and adventures. In Koyuchao and Tsukino we had lived almost as in peacetime. The turn of events could bring only bitter news. But I was pleased. I kept faith with my strange soldierliness. I might be an adventurer in no man's land, a shuttlecock of fate, but my inner self was in balance. The hopelessness of the war, the futility of my wanderings, the despair at any change, fear of the blessings of a return to home and peace, disgust at the insane crimes of humanity, all combined to make me see the last possibility of a completed life in death in Russia. So I moved out with confused spirits. We marched in a northwesterly direction. I gave myself to the melancholy beauty of autumnal landscapes. Rain fell. The tarmac turned to mud, freezing over at night and thawing out again by day. We crossed the Dnieper and found ourselves on the western bank of the river. Ahead of us was the roaring of the battle along the road from Smolensk to Minsk. No one knew where the road was taking us. It disappeared into infinity. At Buddy we spent the night in a barn. A gigantic stove was lit, but the wind came sweeping in. Stars flashed through the thatched roof and snow trickled in. We pulled on our winter gear, which was an improvement on the previous years, drank rum and champagne, slept a few hours, and set off to look for our postings in the gloaming. We got there in the dark, moved into a bunker, and slept in scraps, continually awoken by the fiendish concert of smoke projectors, surprise fire, and sentry duty. But the great battle was almost over. We captured a village and freed a platoon that had dug in there, waiting to be rescued or starved. There was no Russian counterthrust. It was only a few late skirmishes that we caught. The weather grew milder. We lay on pallets, sang songs in all kinds of languages, and got drunk every night. We forgot our worries and our lives. They were worth only a tired tossing away. New position. We marched back along the road. Rain showers brushed the land. We sang and walked, buzzy and optimistic on rum and champagne, and accepted the adventures ahead with an alcoholic equanimity. We were put on trains at Olustino, spent the night in a freight car over cards and wine, and got out at Staraya Bykov. We followed the road through mud, rain and snow, and recrossed the Dnieper. Like men condemned to drown, we stared at the water, measured its depth with apprehensive eyes, shivered and marched on, dully submissive to our fate, tired of war and the lot of being forever at the easternmost point on the front. We reached Selez, a village that had been recaptured only that morning. Russian bazookas and machine guns still lined the street, and the dead lay beside their weapons. We waited for night, huddled shivering around a fire, but it wasn't until morning that we moved off to our posts. We marched through a snowy wood, and stopping to rest once, I fell asleep under a bush. When I awoke, the others had moved off, having taken prisoner a few Russian stragglers who had surrendered after a few shots. We were approaching the main fighting line. Shells came out to greet us on the road. We found a wounded man, abandoned by his comrades. By twos we carried him into cover and bandaged him up while the tank shells crashed, and earth and shrapnel fell on top of us. His face was yellow, screaming, contorted by pain. The veins and sinews in his thigh were exposed, and his blood froze on our hands. He died. We chased after the others. In a blizzard-black night, we put the gun into position. We found several earth holes in the vicinity, just wide and deep enough to take a pair of men lying on their sides. We put up tarpaulins over them, rolled ourselves into our blankets, and slept. No one on watch. The rain pattered down. It dripped into our holes. Thin snow covered the tarpaulins, was melted off by our breathing, and dribbled down the walls. We awoke in a puddle. Soaked and freezing, we staggered out into the fog. A mug of rum was all there was to eat or drink. A Russian shock troop charged and remained lying in the barrage, a long way from our guns. We built a bunker, laid a few boards over the top of it with some straw and sand, set up a stove, and dried out our blankets, coats, and uniforms all night. A brief drum fire from anti-tank guns and mortars brought us out. Dawn. Our infantry was running away. The Russians were charging down the slope ahead of us. We fired, stung by machine guns and grenades. I carried up the ammunition, saw the bullets plug into the snow in front of me. Mortar shells landed nearby. I didn't throw myself to the ground. I walked calmly and upright, as though nothing could happen to me. A counter-attack repulsed the attackers, but soon they were up at us again. We shot off the last of our shells and abandoned the position. The gun was lost. Calmly, by pairs, we walked to another gun 1/2 mile away through machine gun fire and isolated rifle shots. It was a matter of such indifference whether we fell here or drowned on the flight across the Dnieper. We talked about Baudelaire. Sometimes we calmly lay down, waited for the firing to abate, and went on. It was a form of madness. The last man at the other gun was waiting for us. His face was bruised and swollen from flying clumps of earth. Cadavers lay around and the rain poured off them. Flesh and brains were stuck to the walls of a hut. Silently, we shook hands with the survivor. We posted no sentries. Amid rain and drifting snow, we fell asleep. Our own hut burned down, and we were able to rescue only our blankets and bread sacks from it. By the light of the flames, we built a bunker and tore down the beams from a barn. It was big and deep enough for us to sit and lie in. That night I lost my way and got back very late and depressed. The following day I was transferred to a different gun and found more good comrades. We were cheek by jowl, but our worlds were compatible. I had a sense of reawakening. Close to the trench was a little birch wood that contained our bunker. There was a glimmer of yellow from stubble fields under a blanket of white. Winter wheat pushed green spikes through the snow, and on the horizon, conifer forests framed the solemn, melancholy landscape under wintry yellow light. A persistent drizzle thawed out the ground. Bit by bit, our bunker collapsed. We propped up what was left. We didn't rebuild. We were waiting for the march back. We wanted to get across the Dnieper again. That became our obsession. The river crushed us, lamed our thoughts, and became a gloomy leitmotif in all our conversations. Sometimes we paid calls on other guns, huddled close in their holes, sang and argued the toss about war and peace, defeat and victory, and got drunk almost every night. I felt more like a soldier than ever, but like a warrior from some future empire, a secret intellectual process that was profoundly antipathetic to war. I wore my mask, as required by the time, and dreamed of a hermit life in a vine-grown monastery cell somewhere on the edge of the world, with the din of the world only distantly audible, and standing in some intimate relation to death, but quite different. Because even the medieval dance of death seemed merciful and beautiful compared with the bare cadaver, the corpse in no man's land, the living dead, like myself. I was no Christian, and I had no home anywhere outside this world. I drifted through my destiny like someone deracinated, condemned to wander. On all my uncertain travels, I was never able to lean against God as against some shady tree in an oasis. My only goal remained the hope for a better life in peacetime. It would begin the moment the door of my father's house closed behind me. But in the secret chambers of my heart, I no longer believed such a moment would ever come. This was my intellectual advent. That was what I thought on those days of preparation, and only sometimes did I understand. I was still young. The world was open to me, at least once I was back on the western bank of the Dnieper. It thawed and froze again. The landscape stiffened in frost, and when I stepped out of the bunker one night, it was the first time in a long time that I saw stars overhead. Stars, stars, stars. Snow sparkled, frost glittered, and profound silence lay over the earth. I was strangely happy in my gypsy life in the forest. In December, in the open air, a good friend to trees and clouds, the wind singing in the twigs, the smell of snow, resin, and forest floor wafted up. The pine-needled earth seemed warm even in winter. I need ask for nothing, worry for nothing, could dream and hearken undisturbed. This life rejoiced the adventurer in spite of himself, and the privations were not difficult for me. In the dusk, straw and hay fires burned in long rows on the opposite bank, silent signals as night fell. They reminded me of the lit-up towns on the other side of the river where I had been born. Even destruction could create magical pictures, and so, with my old fondness for paradox, I thought of war as an aesthetic problem. We marched up to the Dnieper Bridge, and then came the command to hold a strong point way in the east. In a mild blizzard, we crossed the Ukliast, a frozen swamp with few discernible paths, over man-made channels and pontoons into the unknown. Momoshino, our goal, was like an island. The moon burned down like iced fire. We lived on an island in no man's land. Momoshino, a totally obscure hamlet consisting of a few huts and barns, was made into a strong point. There was a trench dug around the village, studded with many machine-gun nests. Infantry artillery pieces and mortars stood between the huts, and we set up our cannons just behind the trench, camouflaged as a trash heap. We moved into a potato cellar. We unpacked, built ourselves pallets, a table and stools, installed a window and a stove, and felt we'd be here for a while. Ahead of us the land tumbled down a gully. On the other side rose a hill with tiny pines and sparse bushes. The Russians occupied their earth holes only at night. To the north, flares climbed behind the little witchy wood. There, somewhere, was the next strong point, between us, wood, moor, and flat plain. Irregular rifle fire rang out from distant hills. A Russian storm troop was on its way. Suddenly, searchlights came on opposite and combed the territory. Blindly, I plunged back into the dark. The front became restless. An hour later, heavy fire sounded from the north, from the direction of the Dnieper Bridge. We weren't surprised when orders came that we were moving to a new position. After midnight, we marched in bright moonlight to the road. Behind us, the bunker was burning down. The fire slowly receded as we left the enemy behind. No man's land all around. We passed through Selez. It had become a ghost village just behind the main fighting line, pocked by trenches and bunkers and crisscrossed by the veins and intestines of war. Close to the Dnieper, we set up our gun on a hill at the edge of a pinewood. In front of us, a stream flowed through swampy, half-frozen pasture land. The wood was already in enemy hands. It didn't seem possible to escape. The river was too close. Exhausted, we wrapped ourselves in our blankets, lay down in the shelter of young pines on the soft pine-needle-sown ground, and slept. Next day we built a dugout, spread birch boughs over it, covered it with tarpaulins and hay, brought in straw to rest on, and set up the stove we took with us everywhere. We weren't able to sit in it, and the stove didn't generate much heat. But we had a roof, at least we were sheltered from snow and wind, and we slept well. We woke up with rheumatic pain, alarmed by shots, shouts, and cries for help. Our rear guard appeared at the edge of the wood, fled across the swamp, pursued by the Russians, until they found shelter next to us among the trees. We lobbed out some shells, laid down a machine-gun barrage. For all their superior numbers, the enemy withdrew. In the grey, icy winter, we lived in the open air. In the pine wood, we were out of sight of the Russians. A bit of frozen snow still lay in the hollows, and we easily bore the cold. No one bothered with us. Only the field kitchen visited us at night, and so we were the only free men around at the time. Toughened and lazy, we let life do with us what it would. Note: gap in the manuscript, where the enemy's scout parties would rendezvous at night. The field kitchens would come up from the south in a sort of convoy, closely guarded under cover of darkness, and still there were always losses, wounded, killed, and often missing. The Russians took a lot of captives. They were no longer killing them, as they had once done at Mileyevo, and we, in daily expectation of such a fate, were now less worried about it. We were living on a sort of island in a Red Army sea. Sometimes the Russian scout parties would stroll through the village quite unmolested. Often there were little skirmishes. We were on alert day and night. The houses were vacated one by one, were hit by incendiaries or burned down, and even the new moon nights were bright with flames and distant conflagrations. So close to death, on the dividing line between a soldier's freedom and falling into enemy hands, I took to writing out my Russian adventures once more. Night after night. Outside, the sentry's footfall crunched on the snow, machine guns barked out, isolated shells whistled past. Russian nights, and I felt so much at home. Advent and Christmas passed. I stayed up, lived in my memories, and wrote. Some mornings I went to pick up mail and orders way in the hinterland. It was like visiting another island. Daybreak. I wandered silently in the foggy land, and the road was broad. Somewhere other grey-clad pilgrims were travelling into infinity. Overhead the stars were twinkling out. The road seemed to go on forever. Birch trees and conifer woods left ghostly intimations of themselves. All things had a wondrous form, but the landscape remained dead. Mute. Only the fog drifted. Deepest silence surrounded my tracks, as if I were somewhere in space. Behind me I heard voices, messages from the past, indescribably remote. But the wintry land came to life. Bushes and stars reached out their hands in friendship. Snowy light and fog disappeared. Morning air blew on me like God's breath. I was alone, and a melancholy sing-song chimed in me. The snow barely crunched underfoot. The wind played in my hair. I almost had to force myself to remember that there was a war on and that I was a soldier. I believed in my destiny once more, and in what was irreducibly human, some angelic force that was stronger than everything contrary, a sanctuary preserving whatever was best and most characteristic in me across the gulf of the years. Christmas passed like any other day. We drank a lot, but we didn't celebrate. The year fell back into God's hands. A new one came trundling out of the basket of eternity. Only dreams remained. Dreams of returning home and of peace. We were still living in the subterranean soldiers' town of Momoshino and compared ourselves with those monks in India immured in magical temples and forests. Existence pressed in upon us and marked us. The soul built wall after wall around itself and concealed itself from the din of history. It was like a dream. It was true in some magical sense. Like sleepwalkers, we passed over the mystical bridge of life. But all around us we heard the grandeur and the decline of the West. Adventurers' blood pounded in our veins. Our curiosity about foreign parts was satisfied in abundance, and only homesickness remained true to us in the end. We moved out once more. The Russians had broken through. We could hear the sounds of a battle to the rear of us. We marched. We wandered through the smoke and flames of Momoshino. Fires were reflected in the snow. The night gleamed blood-red. We stopped at daybreak, and in the evening we moved into position in a wood near Malokrasnitsa. I became a runner and had more sleep and more time. A light conifer wood. We were near its edge, under continual fire from machine guns and shells. The Russians didn't attack, and one of our storm troops got no farther than no man's land. The winter grew severe. Hoarfrost ornamented the trees like the soul of the twigs suddenly made visible. I loved the wood. The snow on fir and pine in golden sun, hoarfrost on full moon nights, and a baffling disquiet often sent me out at night. I loved life, winter, and danger. It was as though I were now bringing in the harvest of a long and productive time. I had become an adventurer, a wandering mendicant, a vagabond. The war sent me hither and thither like chaff. There seemed no end to my wanderings. But I loved life, winter, and peril. Whatever I lost was really gain. What I saw in loneliness and grief acquired a magical meaning. Whatever I had failed to do was completed, only bigger, and whatever I beheld struck me as being my own work. I stood there calmly, the earth fell into my open hands, and God was near to me. Time and eternity rushed past me. I loved life. Sleigh rides. I flew through the forest. The wind blew and soared in the branches, the horses panted, and the night became a dreamy, drunken revel. Frightened travellers jumped aside. A dusting of snow flew up. The runners creaked and crunched. A bold song was on my lips. Like clouds and stars, I chased through the sleeping land, plain, solitude, ravished by youth and speed. There was no end in sight. Yearning plunged into the distance. Frost caught in my hair, rushing passage as on a sleigh in space. An intoxicating feeling came over me, a burgeoning sense of life, the limitless, exuberant pleasure of being in the world. The freedom of an hour in the Russian winterland. I loved life. Years charged by, death wheeled over the earth, God and his stars perished in the west, and there was war on earth. I was a soldier in danger and in pain, a wanderer, a traveller in space. But I loved life. Pause. Pause. A furlough, a leave, home, home. But it was just an interval. The war went on. Once more I went out there. I loved life. The war began, and we saw God and his stars perish in the west. Death rampaged over the earth. He took off his mask, and his skull face grinned, chiselled with dementia and pain. We set out into no man's land, saw him dance in the distance, and heard the throb of his drums at night. And so he brought in his harvest of corn and tares. He transformed us with his being. He showed us other names and dimensions, and his dreams marked the picture of our time. His shadow fell across our path. His thoughts filled the spirit of the seeker, and sadness, suffering, and fear sprang up from the seed he had sown. Forced marches and dangers gave rise to adventure, but the conversation of the angels stopped at our graves. We, the nameless and the unknown, the solitary and the lover, the wise man and the fool, the rich and the poor, took up the fight with our destiny, and under the constellation of necessity we found a role for ourselves in resurrection and carrion, and decadence, hid my face from God, and finally found myself at home in the void, a speck of dust in space. Under my mask of intellectual exuberance, I lived like a ghost and sought refuge with whores and in wine. Fantasies of flight and deathly longings consumed me. I met my Beatrice. Love taught me to identify beauty in decline, greatness and purity in ruins, dignity and hope in suffering, and blessing, transformation, and mercy in death. A new life began. Like a convalescent, I heard the March winds rushing, and I experienced the spring awakening of the earth. When I had to say goodbye to my love, I put my trust in God and the stars again. The armies were waiting out by the west wall. I paid them no mind. Like a storm wave, the war burst in upon the Netherlands, and I experienced the defeat of the Dutch like a vision. My thoughts revolved around art and humanism. There was eternity in what peoples and individuals had created. Every age and time made their contribution to the edifice, and whoever had fulfilled his duty could die easy. Names might lose their ring, those who had borne them might disappear as the grave-digger mixed their corpses with earth and the wreckage of their works, but their spirits outlasted the ruins, Their souls lived in the destruction and in the memory of future generations. There was no death, and so the war came to touch my sense of life. But when France laid down her arms, my life went on as though nothing had happened. I went to the sea, to my favourite haunts on Darse. I walked the beach in storm and sunshine. I lay on the dunes and dreamed to the crash of the waves, listened to the crickets strumming of hot noons while Pan slept. I sang and whiled away the hours. A stray love flitted along like a butterfly. I strolled through the woods, collected mosses, pine needles and leaves. Grasses and flowers were experiences for me. I looked for bison, listened to the sing-song of the wind, and watched the sun go down over the sea. The sky blazed in apocalyptic colours. Bronze and gold tumbled over the waves. I read on cool, starry nights and hurried through rain and storm. Still intoxicated by the richness of the earth, drunk with summer and youth, I returned to the city. Autumn gave me an induction in death and its various fruits. I loved it already, a sleep without dreams, the extinguishing of the candle, the sweet comfort of non-existence after the effort, the seeking and strangeness of living. In the confusion of my days, I yearned for its quiet, but I was afraid as well of death, which never took the veil off its reality, whose peace was alarming, whose silence droned like a primal storm, and whose mills churned night and day. It was winter again. I saw war and peace as mere intervals in the history of the world. I lost myself once more in endless nighttime conversations about the futility of life, the mask of God, the magic of the devil, and the tragedy of existence. I did my job by day and waited for the call-up to bring the turn in my destiny. But in my thoughts and dreams, my hopes, aspirations, and desires, I was still living without reference to the war, and death was a stranger to me and only an occasional visitor. I drifted like a shipwrecked sailor through the calms of fate. I was no longer a citizen of the world, and not yet a soldier. On my 21st birthday, I received my call-up for the beginning of February. I gave up my job, gathered together my manuscripts, locked away my diaries, and burned the fragments. Restless days without real activity dribbled between my fingers like sand. My bridges to the past broke. There was no path into the future, no star lit my way. Without hope, but not despairing either, tired and somehow feverish, I got through the emptiness of the waiting period. One night began like 1,000 others, but beneath its stars the change began. I dreamed of the threshold of a new life, and by morning I stood before my destiny as a different person. My mother was asleep. The night wind cried outside, showers of rain danced across the roofs, and my reading light burned with its friendly glow. I sat over blank pages, pondered and asked, dreamed and sought, wrestled with gods, angels, and demons, and understood. At first there was nothing but fear and foreboding. We stood at the gate to no man's land and felt the nearness of danger and pain. The years of darkness were beginning as the stars had decreed. Like beggars, we left behind the wreckage of our youth, freedom, love, mind, pleasure, and work. We were required to subject our own lives to the will of the age, and our destiny began like a tale of duress, patience, and death. We could not escape the law. There was a breach in our unfinished sense of the world, and like a dream, the march into the other and the unknown began, and all our paths ended in night. Nothing could be more antithetical to my nature than having to become a soldier, to be anonymous among strangers, a toy at the whim of commands and moods, than having to learn the use of weapons with which I would fight one day for a view of the world that was repugnant to me, in a war I never wanted, and against people who were not my enemies. Like a condemned man, I hesitated on the steps to the scaffold, and felt the sword graze my neck. The judge had broken the staff over me, and in my powerlessness I accepted his sentence. That was my abdication. I smoked, I wrote a line, I drained a glass of wine. The clock ticked, the light flickered along the spines of my books and on the piano. There were aromatic pine twigs in a vase, and Christ's thorn flowering. Hours dropped into the sea of time. The night advanced, and I kept my vigil, pondered and dreamed. The terror of the army years ahead left me no rest. I thought back on the last months of my own life. Like a hungry man facing a long period without food, I hastened through books, concerts, plays and parties, hectic youthful amours and thoughtful hours in the garden of youth. But that night music brought me no consolation, comedy no forgetting of self, tragic drama no reconciliation with my own fate. Every instance of beauty served only to heighten the pain of farewell, and even wine sharpened the anguish of my thoughts. I leafed through records, memoirs and accounts of the previous generation's world war, looking for a stance, a way to confront what could not be averted, to know what awaited me, and to understand the war, to learn my own part in it, and to force conflict, danger and death into my sense of the world. But my reading was as unavailing as my conversations with myself, and as every conversation with others, in the shade of melancholy and laughter. I switched off the light, pulled on my coat, and quietly closed the door after me so as not to wake anyone. The cool night wind riffled through my hair. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, no streetlight lit my way, and there was no one abroad. I wandered through streets and lanes like a stray dog. Everything I passed carried associations of longing and adventure, despair and mania. I went home and once more sat pondering in the ring of lamplight. Midnight came, and I was still up. In the beginning was suffering. We put down the masks we had worn in the early light, draped the mirrors of our being and of our vanity, renounced happiness and the growth of the soul, and took on the features of anonymity. We had the feeling. It had to be this way. We had a lot of past history to atone for. Now fate made us acquainted with the form of our repentance. We accepted it, like a monk the scourge. Under the mask of a soldier, we settled our debt, and to atone for past lives of deception, frivolity and illusion, we consecrated ourselves to pain and danger. We were ready to suffer. Travel was not in my thoughts, any more than adventure, sowing seeds, or a secret maturation. The clock hands spun around. The hourglass scattered its sand. The distant roar of mines, mills, and ports beat against the window. Footfalls echoed away. The loving and the lost were all long since asleep. My room became an island in the cosmos. This was where the light burned for my solitary thinking, my questioning, and my guessing. The future was determined by the years ahead of soldiering. Our fate disentangles itself, and the form acquires definition in what is to come. We were looking for the future. We had a lot to offer and to desire, and now all streets led into life. Fate was something vague that had barely touched our friends, encounters, books, and dreams. As yet we were not marked by anything substantial, anything experienced and lived. But now pitiless life would shape us. We would ripen in denial, survive in hostility, and preserve what was ours in battle. War, the father of all things, was showing us the way. Questions and interpretations loomed in the distance, and we guessed at a good outcome. Our essence was ripening within us. Nothing divine could be taken from us, so long as we kept faith with our humanity. The man would emerge from the wearer of masks, being from appearance, and so would stand before God. I accepted the necessity of what lay ahead. I no longer saw my soldier's time as a cross to bear. I was all set to live. My mother awoke. She saw there was a light on in my room, and she came in and silently stroked my hair. Then I was once more on my own. I brought more wine, filled my glass, drank, and sighed heavily. I didn't want my years of destiny. All the powers and forces within me refused to allow the strange, the hostile, to enter. The future remained a hell, and my ascent did nothing to diminish my fear or struggle. Only my suffering and hoping helped. Nothing beautiful, lofty, or pure happened in no man's land. God did not dwell on battlefields, and the spirit as much as the body died in the trenches. Death held sway in war. What was best in me would be destroyed, and only what was rejected would moulder away. If I ever came home, then a different man, destroyed, marked for all time, someone transformed, would stand before the mirror. Then I would wear the brand of death and lead a ghostly existence with the dead in twilight and night. I emptied my glass. My head ached, my hands shook, my heart beat irregularly. The night was still blue and windy, and I found peace. Life would not permit of any no. Even the most terrible thing wanted to be sanctioned by an amen. I would have to learn to want destruction, to reject being indeed, as I had often done in word and thought, and in this way to give a grand affirmation to anything that might happen to me. I would have to become as the law decreed, to live or die as my star ordained. No refusal, no will, could change my destiny. Life would be lived whether I wanted or no. I just had to live it, to be it. I ate a piece of bread and lit a candle. In its flame, I burned the pages I had covered that night. Then I opened the window and scattered the ashes outside. Dawn dimmed the stars. Day broke, and life went on. It came over me like an awakening. Dreams and images blew away. I looked to the light. Solitude was at an end. Numberless companions were on their way to me from all over the world. They were bearing torches, death's heads and banners, and their singing rushed into dawn and attack. Like a column of pilgrims, they were marching into the distance, and I, nameless, went with them. We had lost our masks, but our essence remained with us. Abroad, in life and suffering, our forms ripened, and in the immortal soul all travails, even on the brink of death, were turned to light. The spirit transformed things and appearances into new life. The ploughshare hurt in the fallow field of our souls. It was no longer a matter of happiness, sadness, life, death. Only fate made sense, and a man's mission. We grew and matured as necessity made us. The mills of suffering ground at the brittle crystal. The fire of warfare purified outlook and process, and death led us within ourselves. But we kept the face of God above us like stars. We lived life as it really was. And so I went to my recruiting inspection, as into a ceremonial advent. I became a soldier,